I never imagined that a simple Christmas gift could turn into one of the most terrifying and inexplicable stories of my life. It was Christmas Eve, 2013, and my 5-year-old daughter could barely contain her excitement as she unwrapped the colorful package containing an Elsa doll from the movie Frozen. Her eyes sparkled with joy at the sight of the blonde-haired, blue-gowned princess, her features carefully molded to capture the essence of the Disney character that had won over the hearts of children worldwide that year. As a single mother working 2 jobs to support my small family, that gift represented months of saving. The smile on my daughter's face made it all worth it. That night, she fell asleep hugging the doll, whispering "let it go" as she drifted off, and I, on the other side of the hallway, let out a sigh of relief mixed with happiness. She finally had what she had longed for, and it brought me a sense of fulfillment. The first few months with my daughter's new companion were uneventful. The doll sang and spoke when the button on her necklace was pressed, much to the delight of my little girl. I would watch with tenderness as imaginary play unfolded in our modest apartment in the suburbs of Houston. Elsa attended tea parties, chatted with other toys, and at night kept vigil over my daughter's peaceful sleep. Everything seemed normal, and the constant presence of the doll became part of our daily routine. I must confess, I've never been a big fan of dolls. There was something about their glassy eyes that always made me feel slightly uncomfortable. They seemed to be watching me, with a gaze I knew to be inanimate, but which still unsettled me. However, seeing my daughter's happiness was more important than any personal misgivings. Besides, I reasoned, it was just a harmless toy, right? Little did I know that this seemingly innocent doll would become the epicenter of a series of inexplicable events that would challenge my sanity and turn our lives into a frightening tale worthy of the most disturbing accounts of psychological horror. Time passed, and routine settled in our home. I worked during the day, took care of my daughter at night, and the Elsa doll remained her inseparable companion. Sometimes, she even brought the doll to the dinner table, placing it next to her plate, insisting that Elsa be present in every aspect of her life. It was about 2 years later that I noticed the first anomaly, something I initially dismissed as imagination, but which would soon become the prelude to a nightmare that would transcend the boundaries of reality. On a particularly exhausting night, I woke up startled. The soft, melodic sound of "Let It Go" echoed down the hallway. Confused and still groggy, I thought my daughter was playing. Even though it was well past midnight, I dragged myself out of bed, feeling the cold hardwood floor beneath my bare feet, and followed the sound to her room. The scene that greeted me froze my blood. My daughter slept soundly, wrapped in her pink blankets, but the Elsa doll, sitting on the shelf, was singing by itself. The button on its necklace was not pressed. I stood in the doorway, blinking several times, certain that I was having a fatigue-induced hallucination. As I approached, the music abruptly stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in the room. I stood there, feeling my heart beat erratically, as fear began to take shape within me. The next morning, I convinced myself that it had all been a vivid dream. After all, real-life horror stories don't actually happen, right? But a sense of unease persisted, a feeling that something was amiss in our home. I decided not to mention the incident to my daughter, not wanting to scare her or taint her relationship with her favorite toy. She continued to play with the doll as if nothing had happened, and for a while, I managed to ignore my own concerns. However, as the weeks went by, I gradually noticed other peculiarities. The doll, which had previously spoken only in English, started randomly switching to Spanish. There was no language button, no setting that could explain this change. Terror, which had previously existed only in movies and books, began to seep into our everyday reality. I watched with growing discomfort as my daughter continued to play, unaware of the strangeness of the words coming out of Elsa's mouth. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the inexplicable events intensified. The Elsa doll, once a symbol of joy for my daughter, became a constant source of anxiety for me. At night, I began to hear soft footsteps in the hallway, as if someone were walking barefoot through the house. But each time I got up to check, I found only darkness, with Elsa motionless on her shelf, her eyes fixed on some unseen point in the void. One night, after putting my daughter to bed, I sat in the living room, determined to rationalize the occurrences. That's when I heard a dull thud coming from her bedroom. I rushed to check and found the doll on the floor, away from the shelf where it usually stayed. My daughter was still sleeping peacefully. I put Elsa back in her place, but a sense of unease settled in my stomach, as if something invisible was watching us. The next morning, I made a drastic decision. While my daughter was at school, I took the doll and placed it in a box. I drove to a distant garbage collection point and disposed of it. I felt a mix of relief and guilt. How would I explain this to my daughter? She would surely be heartbroken over the disappearance of her beloved companion. But peace of mind was worth the sacrifice. In the weeks that followed, our life seemed to return to normal. My daughter was sad about Elsa's disappearance, but gradually moved on. I began to believe that the whole episode had been a series of coincidences amplified by my fertile imagination and exhaustion. Each day, my conviction that I had made the right decision grew stronger. Then, one Sunday afternoon, as I was tidying up the living room, I froze. There, sitting on the bench by the window, was the Elsa doll, intact, as if it had never left our home. In that moment, a wave of despair washed over me, and the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. I understood that I was living a chilling story that defied logic and sanity. My heart raced, and I felt cold sweat trickle down my back as I stared at the seemingly innocent toy. The reality I knew seemed to crumble before my eyes. With trembling hands, I picked up the doll and placed it on the kitchen table. I sat across from it, examining every detail, trying to find any trace that would indicate it wasn't the same doll, but it was identical, from the small scratch on its face that my daughter had accidentally made with a screwdriver to the faint stain on the blue dress. Determined to put an end to this nightmare, I grabbed the doll and locked it in the closet of my bedroom. I spent the night awake, guarding the door, fearing that at any moment it might open by itself. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made my heart leap. The minutes dragged like hours, and no matter how hard I tried, sleep wouldn't come. The next morning, with dark circles under my eyes and frayed nerves, I made a final decision. I placed the doll in a reinforced box, sealed it with multiple layers of tape, and drove for hours until I found a secluded spot, far from any human presence. I dug a deep hole and buried the box, marking the spot with a heavy stone. As the earth fell over the box, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Would this finally put an end to my torment? On my way back, a violent storm formed. Lightning split the sky, and the wind howled as if nature itself were reacting to my action. I arrived home soaked and exhausted, but with a sense of purpose. I was certain that this time the doll wouldn't return. That night, I lay in bed next to my daughter, who slept peacefully, oblivious to the psychological terror I had faced. As the rain continued outside, I reflected on the surreal events of the past few months. I realized that some experiences challenge our understanding of the world. The terror doesn't need logic to be real. As sleep finally claimed me, one last thought crossed my mind. Had I truly gotten rid of it, or was Elsa still waiting somewhere in the shadows, ready to continue her endless song? It was a night like any other in our quiet suburban home. My wife had gone out with our young son, leaving me alone to finish up some pending work. The tranquility of the house was comforting, allowing me to focus on the tasks at hand before the end of the day. After a few hours poring over documents and spreadsheets, I decided to take a break for dinner. I left around 4:30 p.m., enjoying the fresh evening air to clear my head. The local restaurant was as cozy as ever, and the meal was pleasant, albeit solitary. I returned home at 6:30 p.m. to be greeted by our enthusiastic dog, eager for his evening walk. With the house still empty, I set about some routine household chores. I swept the floor, tidied up the living room, and even did some cleaning in the kitchen. It was then that I noticed the menu board on the fridge, filled with my wife's familiar handwriting, detailing the planned dinners for the week. I smiled, thinking of her organization and how it made our lives easier. My wife and son returned around 7:30 p.m. and we spent some time together, sharing the day's experiences and enjoying each other's company. Soon enough, fatigue set in, and at 9 p.m. I decided to turn in for the night. After all, mornings with a young child require well-rested parents. I had barely settled into bed, feeling the comfort of the sheets and the relaxation taking over my body, when my phone vibrated. It was a message from my wife, which I found strange considering she was downstairs. As I opened the message, I came face to face with an image that made my blood run cold. The menu board, which I had seen perfectly normal just a few hours ago, was now completely different. The words were jumbled. Random scribbles covered its surface, and there were incomplete words written in a handwriting that belonged to neither of us. That sight instantly snapped me back to full alertness, a sense of psychological terror beginning to take hold. My heart raced as I stared at the photo on my phone screen. The true scary stories I had heard seemed to come alive right before my eyes. I jumped out of bed, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and rushed downstairs. I found my wife in the kitchen, her face pale, reflecting the fear that I also felt. "Did you see this?" she whispered, pointing to the board on the fridge. There it was, exactly as in the photo, a chaos of letters and scribbles that made no sense. Some words were clearly in her handwriting, but they were distorted, stretched in impossible ways. Others seemed to be written by a shaky, unfamiliar hand. Who could have done this? I asked, more to myself than to her. Our 1-year-old son was sound asleep in his crib, and it was obvious that he couldn't be responsible for this disturbing alteration. The real-life terror was starting to sink in, turning our cozy home into a setting for spine-chilling stories. We examined every corner of the kitchen, looking for any sign of intrusion. The windows were closed, the doors locked. There was absolutely no indication that anyone had broken into our house. The unsolved mystery hung heavy in the air, increasing our anxiety with each passing minute. We decided to call the county sheriff. Despite the late hour, the seriousness of the situation warranted the call. As we waited, we couldn't take our eyes off the board. The words seemed to contort before our eyes, as if they had a life of their own. We were living a frightening tale, and we were the involuntary protagonists of this psychological horror. The sound of tires on the driveway broke the tense silence that had settled in our home. The sheriff arrived sooner than expected, perhaps sensing the urgency in our voices over the phone. His serious demeanor as he entered our kitchen only intensified the feeling that we were living one of those scary true stories we usually only heard about. With a flashlight in hand, the sheriff thoroughly examined every corner of our residence. His experienced eyes scanned every shadow, every crevice, looking for any sign of intrusion. I noticed his expression change subtly when he saw the board on the fridge, a mix of confusion and discomfort that didn't go unnoticed. "In all my years of service," he began, his deep voice breaking the silence, "I've never seen anything like this around here." His words, though likely meant to reassure us, had the opposite effect. The fact that even an experienced officer was perplexed only heightened our anxiety. The house sweep revealed nothing out of place, no signs of forced entry, nothing missing. It was as if a ghost had come and gone without a trace, except for that disturbing menu board. The sheriff advised us to change the locks, a precaution that seemed oddly mundane in the face of the unexplainable event. As the officer prepared to leave, I couldn't help but notice a slight tremor in his hands as he put away his notebook. "You did the right thing by calling me," he said, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was just as disturbed as we were. The true horror stories we used to hear now seemed pale in comparison to what we were experiencing. With the sheriff gone, a heavy silence fell over our home. The clock on the wall seemed to mock us, its ticking hands moving with agonizing slowness. Each minute dragged on, laden with tension and anticipation. It was as if we were trapped in a time bubble, living through one of the most intense, scary stories imaginable. My wife and I took turns changing the locks, a process that would normally be tedious but now felt like our only defense against the unknown. The sound of the screwdriver echoed through the quiet house, punctuated only by the occasional creaks of the hardwood floor that, once familiar, now seemed laden with threat. The early morning hours crept by, and exhaustion began to weigh on us. Yet, the fear kept us alert, our senses heightened to any sound or movement out of the ordinary. The psychological terror was palpable, transforming ordinary shadows into threatening shapes and normal house noises into potential signs of danger. Seated at the kitchen table, our untouched coffee cups growing cold, we couldn't take our eyes off the menu board. The words and scribbles remained, a constant reminder of the inexplicable event that had turned our night upside down. It was as if that board was a window to something beyond our comprehension, a portal to the unknown that defied all logic. As the first rays of sunlight finally began to filter through the windows, we felt a momentary relief. The night of terror had passed, but the questions remained. What really happened that night? Who or what had altered our board in such a disturbing way? These questions would continue to haunt us in the days to come, turning our experience into one of those true scary stories that are passed down, leaving all who hear them with a chill down their spine and the unsettling realization that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. On that fateful night, I fell asleep on the living room couch, exhausted after a long day at work. My husband had already retired upstairs, leaving me enveloped in the comforting silence of our home. The clock on the wall read just past midnight when, suddenly, I was jolted awake by a strange and unsettling feeling. As I opened my eyes, I found myself face to face with an unknown man. His eyes fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. My heart raced, and my blood ran cold. This was one of those true scary stories I had never imagined experiencing. The stranger, noticing that I had woken up, leaned slightly towards me and, in a calm and controlled voice that contrasted with the horror of the situation, said, "The guy upstairs was sleeping deeply." His words sent a wave of terror throughout my body. He had not only broken into our house, but had also gone upstairs and seen my husband sleeping. Paralyzed by fear, I struggled to process what was happening. My mind, still groggy from being abruptly awakened, desperately searched for a way out of this surreal situation. The psychological terror that took hold in that moment was indescribable. A mix of fear, vulnerability, and disbelief. Mustering all the courage I could, my voice trembling, I ordered the intruder to leave. To my surprise and relief, he obeyed without hesitation. With silent steps, he glided towards the back door, likely the same way he had entered, and disappeared into the darkness of the night. I remained frozen on the couch, barely able to believe what had just transpired, my heart still pounding in my chest. After the intruder left, I stayed motionless on the sofa, my body rigid with fear. The silence of the late hours seemed to amplify every small noise in the house, turning them into potential threats. My mind was racing, reliving the moments of terror I had just experienced. This was one of those true horror stories one never expects to encounter. Slowly, I began to regain control over my trembling body. My first instinct was to rush upstairs and wake my husband, but fear kept me glued to the sofa. What if the intruder was still nearby? The real-life terror I was facing was far scarier than any fictional story I had ever heard. With shaking hands, I grabbed my phone from the coffee table. I considered calling the police, but hesitated. What if the sound of the call alerted the intruder? As I debated with myself, my eyes frantically scanned the room, searching for any suspicious movement in the shadows. Every dark corner seemed to hide a potential threat. The clock on the wall continued its relentless ticking, reminding me that time was passing, even though it felt like it had frozen for me. Minutes dragged on like hours, and I remained there, torn between the desire to act and the paralyzing fear that held me captive. The house that had always been my refuge now felt like a perfect setting for scary stories. As the initial adrenaline began to wear off, other questions started to arise in my mind. How did he get in? Why did he choose our house? What would have happened if I hadn't woken up? These unanswered questions joined the chorus of unsolved mysteries that now haunted our once safe and welcoming home. The hours crept by as I remained motionless on the sofa, my senses on high alert. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of the wind through the windows made me flinch. The darkness that had once brought me comfort now seemed to harbor 1,000 dangers. I was living one of those true terrifying stories I never thought I'd experience. Finally, I gathered the courage to get up. With hesitant and silent steps, I began to check each room on the ground floor. My heart was pounding so hard I feared its sound might attract the intruder back. The kitchen was empty, the back door locked, the dining room too was deserted. Still, the psychological terror persisted, making every shadow seem like a threat. Climbing the stairs was a trial. Each step felt like climbing a mountain. The upstairs hallway was bathed in darkness, and I feared what I might find. When I reached the bedroom, I saw my husband sleeping soundly, oblivious to the nightmare I had just lived through. For a moment I hesitated to wake him, afraid that my voice might attract the intruder back. With a trembling hand, I touched my husband's shoulder. He woke with a start, confused by my panicked expression, and whispers interrupted by my tremors. I told him what had happened. His initial disbelief quickly turned into deep concern. Together, we decided to call the police, no longer able to bear the uncertainty and fear alone. The wait for the police to arrive was agonizing. Each minute felt like an eternity. When the sirens finally approached, I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. As the officers examined our house, a terrifying revelation came to light. The lock on the back door had been skillfully tampered with, leaving no visible marks. The intruder was no amateur. He had experience breaking into homes. This discovery only intensified our fear and made us question the safety we thought we had in our own home. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through the windows, the terror of the previous night still hung heavily over us. The police had left, after taking a detailed report and providing us with some security recommendations. We were alone again, but the feeling of vulnerability remained. This was undoubtedly one of the most intense, scary stories I had ever lived through. My husband and I spent the following hours in a state of constant alert. We checked and reinforced every lock, every window. We discussed the possibility of installing a security system, cameras, anything that could give us a sense of protection. But deep down, we knew our peace of mind had been irrevocably shaken. As the day progressed, we started receiving calls from curious neighbors who had noticed the police activity during the night. Sharing our experience was difficult, but it also served as a warning to the community. We learned that similar incidents had occurred in the area, though none as disturbing as ours. It was as if we were living in one of those unsolved mysteries that had intrigued us before, but now terrified us. As night approached once again, the fear within me grew. The idea of falling asleep, of becoming vulnerable again, was almost unbearable. My husband suggested we spend the night in a hotel, but I refused. Something inside me refused to be driven out of my own home by fear. That night, lying in our bed, eyes wide open and ears alert to every sound, I realized that the true terror was not in the break-in itself, but in what it had left behind. The intruder had not taken any valuables, but he had stolen something far more precious: our sense of security, our peace of mind. As the clock ticked away the late-night hours, I understood that this real-life horror story would not end with the dawn. Its effects would linger, shaping our lives in ways we couldn't yet predict. Fear had become our new companion, a constant reminder that real-life terror can be closer than we imagine, lurking in the shadows of our own home. If you enjoyed the video you just watched, you won't want to miss this next one. Click now and I'll see you there.